didn't have the thing. Hi. So I'm going to be talking about sort of like mobile development tools and building mobile apps, kind of. So how many people here have built an iOS app or tried to build an iOS app before? OK, so there's a few of you. How many of you still try and build iOS apps? Fewer of you. And how many of you like find this process to be nice and enjoyable and fun? There's like one person in the back there. OK. So I'm going to start out by talking about yay. OK, maybe I have to resort to this. This is fine. So I'm going to talk to you about developer experience first. So what is developer experience? How many of you build developer tools? That's like half the audience. Cool. So developer experience is sort of an aspirational movement applying the principles of user experience to building developer tools. And so like, it's basically about going from being someone who is building software like this, just kind of like hiding under your blanket because everything is broken and terrible and sad, to being like this. You know, like sort of happier, like things are holding you up and you get to just be happy and like do your thing. Like, don't you want to be like this? So yeah, why do I care about this? Well, I've been building software for a while. Like I've been writing bugs for like the last decade. Occasionally, I may ship something that's not completely broken. And so much of that time has been like sort of just going further and further down the stack because everything I use just like I seem to break it, and then I want to make it not broken. So I work on a tool called CocoaPods, which is a dependency manager for iOS and Mac developers. And it's been used in like 1.9 million applications, which is kind of ridiculous, but that's awesome. And there's over 30,000 public packages now. I also work on a tool called Fastlane, which does build and release automation tools for iOS and Android projects. And I also work for a company called CircleCI, where I work on the Mac infrastructure and mobile build tools, which is pretty fun. And if you want to talk about any of that, come and grab me later. And why should you care? Well, as we just saw, like most of you build iOS apps, and you have to deal with a lot of tools on a day-to-day basis. And some of those tools are pretty great, but there are shortcomings, and they're really, really frustrating. Like, software is complicated. We work on bigger and bigger systems that have to deal with harder and harder problems. And there's a push to do all of this more and more quickly. And like the expectations are really, really high these days. Like we saw in Michelle's talk earlier, even like a few hundred milliseconds delay can have huge, huge impact on your users' like experience and what you then get from them as well, which isn't like great when it doesn't work out. And like sometimes it can feel like we're doing this, just kind of falling under a mountain of complexity and sadness, because how can anybody attempt to model this in your head? Like, what makes tools good? Like, convention over configuration. So what I mean by this is my computer's OK. When someone first starts using your things, you should have conventions that make reasonable defaults, but allow them to configure them later. So you stay out of their way and let them get done what they need to get done. An example of this is a gem spec. where you have lots and lots of things that you can configure, but only 6 of these are actually required. Yes, there are 8 on here because I also added a license and something else. But it lets you incrementally build up as you need more and more things, and you can make the project do whatever you want, but there are well-established conventions that are the defaults. Documentation. Documentation is really important, both to help people get started with your thing, and also to keep them successful as they keep on using it. Because otherwise they end up looking at the source code, and unless they're you, they probably don't understand what you actually intended. Handle failures. It's really important to acknowledge the fact that your software will break, and that users will occasionally actually be wrong and manage to do weird and unexpected things. And so when things fail, it's really important to handle that in a way that helps people. For example, in CocoaPods and Fastlane, Auto wrote a tool that when a unhandled exception is thrown, we go and search GitHub issues, and then show the top 3 issues and a link to search for the exception that you had, which is super useful and is really great when trying to debug things and you go and see the issue and it's like, oh, OK. Although occasionally people still file issues that include this in the output. And it's important to celebrate when people do things well. So for example, in CocoaPods, when you release a pod, we give you this little blurb, which is like, yay, you just shipped this thing. You shipped this version at this time. Go and tell your friends about it. And you can screenshot the thing, you can tweet it, and that's kind of nice. Because it's always good to be told you're doing a nice day, doing a good job. And it's important to enable people to do things that they can't necessarily do on their own. So whether that's through building things that make it easier to debug stuff or whatever. And so now, that's the preamble of what are the things. And now, so let's start taking a look at how people actually build apps. If you're just using Xcode and doing everything the normal Apple blessed way. So most people build a lot of UIs because that's what we want to do, right? We want to build great experiences for the users of our apps. So a lot of people use storyboards, which are these big drag and drop editor for building out a bunch of your layout. How many people use storyboards? How many people have used storyboards in the past and don't anymore? And how many people have had to resolve merge conflicts in storyboards? Did anybody do that and also still like storyboards? That's what I thought. They're really great for getting started, but as your team grows, it's sort of really hard to actually manage them and stay up to date, and then Xcode might be broken, and then it corrupts your storyboard, and then you can't open your storyboard anymore, and then you have to revert to the Git history, but then you lost all your work. And that's sad. That's just so sad. And alongside your storyboards, you have a bunch of really hard to maintain animation code and fancy graphics because people really like looking at pretty things. So you write all of this code, you do these things, you build your app, you run it on the simulator, you go, you tap through the app, and then you find the thing, and then you test that your animation worked, and then you realize that actually you typed 100 milliseconds rather than 50 milliseconds, and everything looks weird and slow. And so it's just a lot of this. The feedback loop is so incredibly slow. I've seen applications where you have to wait 40 seconds from making this tiny little change to having the app running. And if you use Swift, there was this like release of Xcode where if you changed a storyboard, it would recompile your entire app. And so then your cycle time is like 40 minutes to move something 3 pixels to the right, which nobody wants to spend their day doing. iOS apps also tend to do a lot of networking, like a lot of networking. Like so many apps now are clients to various different services. So like Twitter or a messaging service or like whatever. And so this means you do like a bunch of data parsing, like doing mangling of types and like trying to get your like big JSON blob into being like a nice typed model object. And like it's just a lot of code that nobody wants to maintain. There's also deployment, which is something that's like a personal pet peeve of mine. Like, you go through the process of spending months building your nice, shiny new app. Like, you've built the best app in the world. Like, your app is amazing. It's like so beautiful. It's so fast. It works really well. And then, like, say you want to run it on your phone. And like with Xcode 8, this was like reasonably easy. Like, you sign into Xcode. You let it fetch your development teams. You select your development team in each of your projects. And you run it, and it works, right? At least that's what the keynote said. And then in practice, like there's this really fun error code that people get when code signing is broken. It's exit code 65. I see a few smirks in the audience from people that do anything on CI ever. Because when you break your code signing configuration, it is technically the user's fault. But Xcode just kind of goes, I'm going to give up code signing now. Exit code 65, user error. And no debug information. It's quite sad. But if this worked for you, what if you wanted to then like control it yourself because you're in a bigger team now? Well, now you have to do all of this. You have to sign into developer.apple.com. You have to create your app ID. You have to create a certificate signing request, which itself is open keychain access. Go to the top left. Then there is another drop-down menu. Then there is request a new certificate. Then you select a CA, and then a bunch of other things. And then eventually you get the certificate signing request that you upload to Apple. You use this to create your development certificate, which you then download. You import this into your keychain. And then you have to try and find the private and the public key so you can export them so other people in your team can use it. And as you can tell, this takes a while. And how many people can ever actually remember how you do this and don't have to like try and look up some random blog post from like 5 years ago that's like, this is how you make all of this work? And then like, what if you also want push notifications in your app? Well, there's the previous slide, and then you create an Apple Push Notification Service SSL certificate, or you create an Apple Push Notification Service authentication key, depending on which API you want to use. You upload this to your push servers, and then you build and run the app on your phone. You try and send a test notification. Nothing happens. Why? Who knows? You spend the rest of the day debugging the service, your app, and your certificates. And it's just so sad. But like, has anybody in the audience ever done this and had it work first time? How many people have done this and had the same experiences that I'm describing here? Yeah. And then you want to release your app to the App Store, and it ran out of screen. Like, you build your app, then you go through all of these things. You take a lot of screenshots. You find all the localization bugs in your app and like start over again. And then you do some more things. And then there is the brutal agony after you submit an app as you wait between 3 days and how long is a piece of string for your app to be reviewed. Then you get your app is in review notification. You're sat there eating your dinner. The iTunes Connect app sends you a notification because they can make this work. And your app has been rejected. It's not very nice. And so by now, we're feeling kind of like this. Like, why do I try? Why do I do any of this? And so we really want to go back to being more like this. So how do we go back to being more like this? How do we get to be happy? Nice weather, blue skies. Well, we can do that through introducing some tools that deal with the pain and the suffering. And so how do we make building UIs better? There's some really great tools for helping to debug and improve that. So one of these is an app called Reveal, which lets you inject the framework into your running app. And then you can sort of explode out the UI. You can go in, you can view all of your auto layout constraints. You can change them, you can update colors. And you can see them while it's on your phone or in the simulator, which is a really, really useful tool when you're tweaking layouts and stuff. You can also use injection for Xcode, which is a runtime code injection tool for your app. So you change your code, you hit save, it picks up the changes, it compiles it, it builds a dylib and injects it into the app to basically just swizzle what was there. And then you can just click around in your app to make it recreate things. Another downside of this is that you end up having to write all of your UI in code. And writing all of your UI in code is a lot of code. It's a lot of code that you have to maintain and test. This is 2 labels on a screen and is 20 lines of code, which isn't really nice. And that's also using a bunch of libraries to make that not. But yeah. There's also the question of tools like React Native, especially when you're prototyping your app, or if you have an app that is mostly just driven by an API. Because you don't necessarily need to do all of the work of building a native app, depending on what your needs are. With that, you have a much, much faster development style, because you have code injection by default, and it will intelligently relay out your views when you make changes, which is pretty nice. And you can improve your experience with networking with a few cool little tools. So how many people in the audience write Swift? And so you're probably familiar with the JSON mapper of the week to convert your big, horrible, untyped hash of all the things into your nice, pretty structs and classes with the types. But there's a new one of these every other day. And there has been for the last 3 years. But it's fine. There's some pretty cool ones that do their job. You can also use code generation for this with tools like Sorcery, where you can just be for this kind of thing, I want to generate a bunch of my model, which is pretty nice. There's also tools like Charles, which will let you man-in-the-middle proxy your app and see all of the requests that are being made to anything. You can go in, you can view the request, you can view the response, which is really useful if you're checking if anything is really broken. And apparently in newer versions of Charles, you can even use this to debug binary formats like protobufs and other HTTP2 traffic, which is really nice. Because debugging that by yourself is really, really hard. And when it breaks, it breaks. And how do we improve deployment? Well, it turns out that when Felix made Fastlane, he made a bunch of really awesome tools for this. And so the several slides that I showed you earlier of deploying an app, Well, that becomes this and this, which is actually really nice compared to like several slides of like, here's where you go and do this manual clicky, 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 click. Like, so now, with a few simple things, we are far more like this, which is pretty great. And that went faster than I thought it would. But if you have any questions, I guess that's time for now. Questions?
Okay, well, if there's no questions, then let's give another round of applause. And then, to show our appreciation, we have a nice little sketch of you.
Thank you. Well, I guess I know what I'm doing this afternoon. What is the JSON parser of this week? That is a good question. I don't know. I haven't really read Twitter this week. How does this compare with Android? So Android development is actually much better for certain things because you have the entire ecosystem of Java, which has been around for too long. You have good tools, you have good refactoring tools built into your IDE. But you have the problem where the emulator just won't start on most people's machines. Or if you try and run an Android emulator in resource-constrained environments, it just doesn't happen. A lot of the deployment options are a lot better on Android, though, because the Play Store is basically within an hour of hitting the button, your app is on the Play Store, which is really nice. So it's different things, I guess, if that answers the question. How does mobile compare to web development? Well, so I actually tried React for the first time about a week ago. And it was actually kind of really cool. I made changes in my editor, and before I had looked over to my second screen with the web browser, the changes had already been made. And I've never had an experience that was actually that fast. So that was pretty fun. But also web browsers. Which areas apart from networking, user interfaces, deployment still need improvement and automation? Well, testing on mobile platforms is still kind of awful. Xcode build doesn't really give you, XC test doesn't really give you any way to customize output or have middleware or good fixtures. It's kind of painful. Model layers and other random controllers got a lot better now that we have code generation as a reasonable option. So yeah, that's the main things that annoy me now. Are there any platforms where the vendor ships easy tools like Fastlane by default? That's actually kind of hard to answer because everywhere else you can kind of ship whatever you want because most other platforms aren't necessarily super closed. Facebook have shipped a bunch of really good tools around React. I don't know what deploying things to Windows looks like anymore. I haven't tried for a long time. But when I first started writing code, I wrote VB and C#. And I had to do all of these things to package all of .NET into my app. And then I had to send this to someone, and then it wouldn't work because I forgot this thing. So I hope it's not like that anymore. How do we support these tools on Circle CI? Well, we give you a VM, and you can run essentially whatever you want. But like, if tools use like reasonably standard output, like JUnit or whatever, then we can automatically pass this and like show you your test failures. We also automatically install like any gems or like node modules that your project depends on, and then you can use those to run whatever. What's the one tool besides Xcode that everybody should be using? Xcode is a lot of things in one, but OK. So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you two answers. One is a tool that's inside Xcode that you should use a lot because it's awesome, and that's LLDB. So like, rather than like making a bunch of changes in your app and then going and running them, you can like do some stuff to like just call it from LLDB. And also Charles, which I covered earlier, because it has saved me hundreds of hours when I'm building apps, not having to go and like figure out what the request would have been, or if I'm using like OAuth 1, go and re-sign requests. Like I can just see what was happening, and that is super useful and valuable because I worked a lot on sync and stuff. What are shortcomings of React Native for production apps? If you take on React Native, you're taking on like hundreds of dependencies that you don't necessarily want to have to maintain yourself. And it's also something that's built by a private company for a private company. And the community could always go and fork that if Facebook took it in a direction that they didn't agree with. But when you take on any large external dependency, that is something that you may have to eventually do.